David was busy setting up for the big Halloween witch exhibition when he finds a strange artefact. Taking it home to investigate, he has no idea of the horrors that are to unfold. Hi, my name is Shar, and this is the And Other Stories podcast, where I read stories of the supernatural and criminal, both real and fictional, works of fiction written by me. The Witch. With a sigh, he took another bubble-wrapped item out of the polystyrene peanuts, squeaking as it came, setting his teeth on edge. It was a very monotonous task he had embarked on. Cataloguing all of these artefacts was going to take all day, possibly into the next day, and he really did not have the time to spare. His research on the fall of the Bridge of Westernmouth had really taken a fascinating turn. A structural fault in the iron supplied by the... Oh well, never mind. Halloween would soon be over, and this charade of an exhibition would be packed up and sent back from whence it came. Witchcraft, how incredibly tedious. The entire museum population of the Western Hemisphere would likely be doing witchcraft. It'd be nice to be somewhat original for a change. David had worked at the museum for 4 years now, and had just been given free rein on his own research project when it was halted for the grand exhibition of the season. Being the relative newcomer amongst his fellow historians, it had regrettably fallen to him to catalogue and research all artefacts sent to them by the much larger sister museum in London for their big Halloween exhibition. They're cast-offs, no doubt, he thought to himself. Nevertheless, the quicker he was done here, the quicker he could go back to his work. Rubbing his tired eyes behind his lenses, he straightened his frames on the bridge of his nose and proceeded. So-called spellbook, candles, goblets and knives, all he was sure perfectly innocent items from perfectly innocent people going about their daily lives. The real interest of the witch trials across Europe was of course the fascinating study of human behaviour, when a tiny seed of doubt was placed in the minds in the community and watching it spread like a contagious disease. It seemed here, however, that to draw in the crowd, one must put on a show, make believe that some of these items may have come from real witches creating spells and potions in their crooked cottages in the woods. Children's stories. Cheap tactics to up the numbers of visitors, nothing at all to do with real history. Once he had ticked off all the inventory from the second box, he started to push the packaging back into the box. Then something stabbed his finger. He reflexively yanked his hand out of the box and examined it, observing a single droplet of blood gathering on his fingertip. Swearing under his breath, he drew back the old newspaper and packing peanuts to find the inconspicuous item at the bottom. At first it seemed to be a plain stick or smooth bit of wood. Confused, David lifted the item out to further examine it. It was about 5 inches long and not solid as he had imagined, but hollow like a tube. One end had been broken or damaged in some way, which had created sharp spikes, resulting in the drawing of blood from his finger. It was also apparent, on closer inspection, that this was not wood, but bone, discoloured and very old bone. David looked back to his inventory list. Everything had been ticked off. This was definitely not an item from there. It must have been overlooked, he thought, small as it is. "David, could you give me a hand over here?" came a call from out in the hall. Margaret had, once again, tried to carry all the reference books in one trip and was now dangerously verging on a workplace health and safety incident. The paperwork would be a nightmare if she broke her neck, he thought sarcastically. "Sure thing, just coming," he shouted, as she came into view and David had to rush forward to catch the falling books and papers, swiftly stowing the old discoloured bone in his pocket to investigate later. "Is that all the books you wanted, David?" she asked breathlessly. "Yes, thanks, Margaret," he said, straining under the weight of several dusty volumes full of dates and names of accused witches, like a grim roll call. This would be a very long day. When he got home that evening, his eyes burned, his ears were ringing, and his fingers were slashed with paper cuts. It was all he could do to just flop down in his armchair, removing his glasses and pressing his fists into his eye sockets. This exhibition couldn't be over soon enough, he thought. The clock ticked in the silence as he sat there, lists and numbers rolling behind his eyelids. He lay his head back onto the chair, just to close his eyes for 5 minutes. He awoke to darkness several hours later. There was a ringing of his name in his ears as if someone had just called him. The only light was the sickly orange of a nearby streetlight glowing through the window. Perhaps it was the drowsiness, or a dream he had not quite woken up from, but he felt he was not alone in the room. A presence loomed over and almost burned into his right shoulder. Fighting all his illogical fears, he turned and peered over the back of his wing-back chair, eyes straining into the dark corner of the room and seeking out the source of his uneasiness. Slowly, a slim silhouette started to protrude from the shadows, stooped shoulders, shaggy, unkempt hair. The silence was assaulting him. The ticking of the clock seemed to speed up to the rhythm of his heart. Was it his own, or could he hear another breathing? He tried to hold his breath to find out, but the terror had a grip on his chest. Unable to take it any longer, he broke the freeze with which the panic held his limbs and launched himself to the side of the room, flicking on the light. Nothing. There was nothing. He went back to the chair and threw himself into it, the adrenaline waning. He reached to the small table beside his chair for his glasses and felt his hands close over another object. Glancing sideways, he saw in his hand the odd bone artefact he had pocketed earlier. He looked over at his jacket hanging on the back of the door. He couldn't remember removing it, but he'd been so exhausted that meant very little. The clock on the mantel showed him it was a little past 12. He must have been asleep for about 4 hours. Running the object along his fingers, he looked at it more closely. The one jagged edge where he had cut his finger still had dried blood caked into it, a dark red drip running from the lip all the way through the hollow tube to the other end. It was old and discoloured, obviously a bone from an animal. His historian curiosity started to flare inside him, as it often did at historical mysteries. With a creak from both his bones and the old chair, he stood and walked to the old desktop computer in the corner. It always took a while to start up, so he took the opportunity to go through to make a cup of tea. The kettle hissed as he opened the cupboard to reach for a mug. Without looking, he put the mug on the worktop where it wobbled and toppled to the floor. He had placed the mug directly on top of the bone. Had he carried it through here? He thought he had left it beside the computer. How odd you can do things so absent-mindedly, he thought. The kettle continued to hiss, the sound bouncing off the old stone walls of his cottage kitchen. The harmonising echoes started to sound almost like words, an ancient language being spoken in quiet, evil whispers. He cursed his imagination, his nerves still electrified by his fright in the dark. The kettle clicked off as it started to boil, but the hissing continued, quiet and without any obvious direction. David strained his ears for the source, finally landing on the cupboard directly opposite. His shaking hand reached out for the handle, fear and adrenaline telling him to run, logic and sense telling him to investigate. The hissing increased, both in volume and speed, as he touched the handle and pulled the door open. There was silence. An empty cupboard. He looked down at the object in his hand, his uneasiness at the evening's events growing. His desire to name the strange artefact burning in his gut, he returned to the computer, tea forgotten. The blue screen glowed in the dark room, throwing a long shadow onto the opposite wall as he sat in front of it. He held the object in one hand, his other hovering over the keyboard, unsure of what to search for. He tried various combinations of words. Bone artefact, ancient bone, hollow tube artefact. All proved useless. He had just turned away to start that cup of tea once more when he heard the quiet but unmistakable sound of the tapping of letter keys. He turned slowly just as it stopped and the computer whirred to life, bringing up the search results. In the search bar were 2 words, cursing bone. In his frozen panic, all he could do was quickly flicker his eyes from one word to another. To cause ill will, blood poured through, curses uttered, and the most prominent, witches, emblazoned across the title, were the words he saw before the screen flickered and went black, plunging the room into darkness. His breathing far exceeded the speed of the ticking of the clock, which was the only other sound. A trail of light led in like a golden carpet from the hallway through the open lounge door. A quiet giggle from the corner of the room startled him from his fixed state. He ran and stumbled towards the hall. Turning right as he reached the bottom of the stairs, he intended to make straight for the door. But as he reached it, a voice, a hoarse and cruel voice, shouted his name, followed by a string of an ancient language he did not recognise, chanting relentlessly, louder and louder. The voice echoed from the end of the hall, but there appeared to be no source. Horrified and disorientated, he lurched backwards, pressing his palms into his ears so he did not hear any more of the terrible voice. His feet found the stairs, and he leapt 2 stairs at a time to reach the top, and threw himself into the bathroom, his heart punching its way through his chest, his lungs painfully keeping pace with his terror. His shaking hands slammed the bolt shut, and he backed up against the sink. He could hear nothing. The harsh fluorescent light buzzed overhead as he strained his ears to hear anything outside of the door. There was only silence. As the minutes ticked by, his breathing slowed. His watch showed the time was now after 1. Had he actually seen or heard anything? He couldn't be sure now. It could have all just been his late-night imagination, but it had seemed so real. He had almost convinced himself it was all just imagination as he turned to face the sink and the mirror above it. He looked up. Behind him, a hooded figure slowly raised its head. A manic grin spread across its evil face, red eyes wide and staring straight into his. It raised a bony, bloodied hand to show the hollow bone, blood pouring through it. The figure started to chant, as David drew breath and let out a terrified scream, just as the lights went black. "So, who rented the house before?" "A young man, I believe. Very sad. He went missing about a year ago. The police never found any leads at all. Anyway, here's your key. Call me if there are any problems." Thanks," she said, as she closed the door on her landlord, perplexed at this surprising bit of information about her new house. "Emily, do you like your new room?" she called to her daughter, who was upstairs exploring. Emily was at the window, picking up a strange object. A tube made of wood or something, but it looked like it had blood on it. Yuck. "Mummy, what's this?" she called as she picked up the bone, cutting her finger in the process. Thank you for listening. I hope you liked it. I am Shar, and this was the And Other Stories podcast. I'll see you next time.